China's perspective on relations with Canada is one thing. Canada's view, of course, is quite something else. With us now for that, let's welcome, in Vancouver, British Columbia, Paul Evans, professor in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs at the University of British Columbia and author of Engaging China. And Joanna Chu, who covers Canada-China relations for the Toronto Star and is the author of the forthcoming book, China Unbound. And let's also welcome in the east end of the provincial capital, David Mulroney, who was Canada's ambassador to China from 2009 through 2012. Grateful to have all you three with us tonight here on TVO. I thought maybe we'd just start by getting your initial reactions to the interview that we just did with the Chinese ambassador. Professor Evans, you want to start us off? What stood out for you in particular?
Well, the ambassador's comments indicated how difficult and fraught the Canada-China relationship is at this point. It's in part because of vastly different understandings in our publics about the other. This is not just a moment of a diplomatic storm, but beneath it are changing public attitudes and a changing global situation that is going to make working with China, living with China, much more complicated for Canada and other countries, and for the Chinese in dealing with us.
Joanna Chu, what stood out for you?
Good work trying to get some straight answers from the ambassador, by the way. I emphasize because I worked in China in Beijing, and I tried to go to foreign ministry briefings to try to ask foreign officials of China questions, and often I got the same kind of runaround anytime anything was sensitive. I could have fact-checked every statement basically, but just two. I think the ambassador said that there's no link between the two Michaels cases and Meng, where in fact previous officials said publicly, and also Trudeau said that Chinese officials made it very clear that there was a link between the two cases and that China wants the two Meng released in exchange for the two Michaels freedom. And secondly, the fact that the ambassador said there is rule of law in China. In fact, Xi Jinping said several years ago that the party is above the courts in China, and that judges, lawyers must be loyal to the party. So his own president contradicted the ambassador there.
Yeah, I mean, everybody knows that. So why would the ambassador try to say different?
It's interesting because I think actually he spoke with my newspaper and his tone was a bit more defensive and abrasive. And to you, he was quite polite and, tried to just spin everything in the way that he wanted positively. So perhaps China does feel like there is rising negative public sentiment against Beijing and might want to do some PR works to repair some of this reputation, but they're not willing to actually speak honestly about what's happening.
Ambassador Mulroney, how about for you?
Well, I think numbers you quoted at the beginning of your conversation with the ambassador, the plummeting Canadian numbers vis-a-vis respect for China, admiration, friendship, put him into a defensive crouch, and I've seen Chinese diplomats do this before. They get a little bit robotic in their repetition of things that not only do we know are not true, but they know are not true. But I'm going to disagree with Paul. I don't think this is because both countries are unable to understand each other. I think what's happened in Canada is an unprecedented degree of focus on China, in part because of the terrible things that are happening to Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, but also because of Xinjiang and Hong Kong and South China Sea, China's wider repression against religious minorities throughout the country. And Canadians are reacting the way a democratic and free people would react in the face of that, including in the face of significant Chinese interference in Canada itself.
I know I talked to the ambassador about this, but I'd like to get your views on this as well, because this goes back to the tweet from the Consul General in Rio de Janeiro, who tweeted a photo of Prime Minister Trudeau and the following statement. He said, "Boy, your greatest achievement is to have ruined the friendly relations between China and Canada and have turned Canada into a running dog of the U.S. Spendthrift." Okay, Paul Evans, I mean, that sure, to my eyes, doesn't look like an attempt to introduce peace and harmony to the Canadian-Chinese relationship, but what do you make of it?
It's a nasty comment, unfortunate. I don't think it's on orders from on high. At least I wouldn't expect that. This is a childish, undiplomatic kind of comment that, again, just inflames, rubs Canadians the wrong way and sends out the wrong signals for how China needs to manage these issues. A real mistake.
Joanna, I'm not sure I've heard, maybe since the days of Chairman Mao, anybody refer to a Westerner as a capitalist running dog, but here we go again. Just for those who don't know the expression, what's that supposed to mean?
Yeah, I actually thought it was an English expression because living in China, I heard it so much like translated through state tabloids, like hawkish ones like Global Times. Basically, running dog, literally, it means a dog that runs for scraps. And it's used in China as a pejorative, meaning that like if someone's a lackey or flattering or kind of like slavish to someone more powerful. So in this case, he's calling Trudeau a running dog for Biden and the U.S. administration, basically. But just to get more context on this, a tweet like this, it seems kind of really out there and it should be unusual. But in recent years, we've seen a lot of statements like this from Chinese diplomatic officials, including ambassadors, consul generals. For example, in Denmark, the ambassador threatened like the tiny island of Faroe, threatening in really harsh words to withdraw a trade deal if Denmark doesn't use Huawei as its internet client for some business with Huawei. So it's part of a trend that people have called wolf warrior diplomacy in China, where maybe from 2 decades or a decade ago, Chinese diplomats were a lot more like the diplomats around the world that are trying to improve relationships and to put China's best face forward. But in recent years, it seems that anytime Chinese diplomats, some of them see any sort of offense or slight, they tend to return it like 10 times more harshly, more aggressively.
Well, let me pick up on that with Paul Evans, because well, I mean, I may be out of date on this, but I always recall that Canada and China had the basis of a decent relationship, in part because the current Prime Minister's father was one of the first Western leaders to recognize the People's Republic more than 50 years ago, and, Dr. Norman Bethune and all of that. What has happened to that relationship, Professor Evans?
Steve, I think that the events of the last 2 years have put us into a whole new chapter in the relationship. And respect, trust have really been tested and found wanting in this new period. So that the Norman Bethunes, the legacy of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, the legacy of 40 years of engagement, we've now entered a new chapter. This is not just a diplomatic storm, but it really is a question about whether we're in a new season, that we're in a winter in a relationship that could get colder, but that is, we're not, even with the release of the two Michaels and the Madame Meng, we're not going to be able to go back to the kind of expectations we had for the relationship even 2 years ago.
Let me get David Mulroney to pick up on that, and we should just explain we're having some technical issues with Ambassador Mulroney's feed, and so we're only going to get him on the telephone as opposed to seeing his sunny presence on our program. But David, what responsibility do you think Justin Trudeau bears for the state of the relationship today?
Well, I think he bears a significant amount, and it's in part because I think we've had to, as Canadians, sit through his personal re-education on China. And I know he has repudiated that unfortunate statement he made before he became Prime Minister, that he admired China's basic dictatorship, that China was the country he most admired. And it's been a long time really shedding that. When he went to China to try to negotiate a free trade agreement with China, he came thinking that he could persuade the Chinese to accept his progressive agenda. That, more than even his earlier statement, convinced me that he was completely unrealistic about the country he was up against. So now, after incident after incident, and after the particular trauma and the terrible things that are happening to our two citizens, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, I think he's closer to an understanding. But I would also add, and just from my own background, his two appointments, his two ambassadorial appointments, have reflected that naivete to a certain extent, because in both John McCallum and in Dominic Barton, he's promoted promoters who really, I think, share his own sense of optimism vis-a-vis what's possible, vis-a-vis comprehensive engagement.
All right, let me pick up on that. Dominic Barton is the guy right now, Joanna. How's he doing?
Well, he was in Canada when the two Michaels were in trial, so people did ask questions about why he was in Canada. And he said, or, officials said it was to try to forge a new China policy. But Canada has actually been promising since the Michaels' arrest that they would relook their China policy, which since Pierre Trudeau's time has really emphasized engagement, but it kind of came at expense of speaking up about human rights in some cases. Trudeau's father, he actually wrote a book about his travels in China during the time of the Great Famine, and he didn't talk about the famine. So I think that legacy is kind of mixed and kind of controversial, Trudeau's father, whether he kind of paved a way for Canada to be unprepared for these really difficult human rights and diplomatic issues. And I should also note that the two Michaels aren't the only first Canadian political prisoners who appear to be political prisoners. Hussein Salil, he's a Canadian citizen. He's Uyghur Canadian, and he was actually kind of kidnapped in Uzbekistan. He didn't dare to go to Xinjiang because he was outspoken about what was happening with Uyghurs back then, being persecuted, but China was able to get Uzbekistan to extradite him to China, and he's been in jail since, and he's had no access to Canadian consulate support, no lawyer. His family doesn't know what crime he's been accused of, and there's several other cases, mostly Canadians of Asian descent. So unfortunately, I think racism might play a role where when it's like two white men, it's become like, oh, they're really Canadian, and this is unacceptable. But we've actually had Canadians kind of taken hostage and political prisoners in China for a while, and
we have heard that racism angle. Yeah, we have heard that racism angle been raised over the last couple of weeks in increasingly loud voices. Paul Evans, I wanted to get you back in here, though, to get your view on the suggestion that maybe Dominic Barton was too naive a guy for the job at this particular time in the Canadian-Chinese relationship. What say you?
Well, I don't think that understanding our politicians is naive is the right starting point of the analysis. I think that the Trudeau government and its ambassadors have been thrown into this is a new moment in China's relations with the world. It is a more combative and difficult one, made more complicated by the geopolitical confrontation with the United States. And that the China we're dealing with now, Xi Jinping's China, and is more repressive, more assertive, more pushy in international affairs. And any Canadian Prime Minister, whether it was Stephen Harper or even a future Conservative Prime Minister, is going to have to deal with China as it is. It's not a matter of naivety about engagement working. It did work in many kinds of ways. It's about what engagement will look like now that the circumstances are much more difficult. What can we do with China other than slide into a full Cold War confrontation?
Well, follow up on that, if you would, Professor Evans. How do both of our countries, which are neck deep in this intractable situation right now, how do we get out of it?
Well, in the immediate irritant, the three M's, Madam Mung and the two Michaels, I think is inextricably. Those are inextricably linked. Whatever the views of the ambassador expressed earlier today. How do we move forward? We move forward in a way where we identify those areas where we must push back against China, individually as a country, but also collectively with others. But that we also have a large zone of cooperation with China, which is necessary and possible. For example, in trade, strangely, our trade with China last year, in the midst of all of these problems, increased by 8%. But I think the third and the most important part is that we have to find ways to continue deep and extensive dialogue with China on areas where we don't see eye to eye, but where we do see there may be common ground. And I think that's the way, strangely enough, where we can open up the Xinjiang issue in a constructive way going forward, where at the moment it's a nightmare of tit-for-tat retaliations.
Let me pick up with David Mulroney on that. We know that in the headlines, there is a great deal of saber rattling right now. Do you suspect, Ambassador Mulroney, based on your own experience, having been in China in the last decade, that there are I don't know. Are there back channel things going on right now we might not know about that suggest that this thing can get out of the muck?
I'm not optimistic about that. I think what's happening in China is unprecedented. And let me just add, sorry to disagree with Paul, the Prime Minister has had since 2015 to understand Xi Jinping. So I think it's more than fair to hold him accountable for not understanding him. And he appointed someone in Dominic Barton who said that he was a great fan. He said he had drunk the Kool-Aid on Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative. So his learning curve is stretching out pretty long, too. But as to back channels, I think China now is hunkered down because there's a crisis with Canada, but there's a crisis with the United States, which is far more serious for them, with Australia, with India, with the UK, with Europe. They haven't had this many crises to deal with, all of them of their own making, all of them due to Xi Jinping's overreach. And we're seeing them respond in two ways. One is the kind of robotic response that you heard from the ambassador to Canada, which is the more traditional response. But we're also hearing increasingly irresponsible tweets from people like younger diplomats, like the Consul General from Rio, which insulted the Prime Minister directly and also invoked language from the Cultural Revolution. We've had, the Chinese embassy in Washington talked about Uyghur women as, breeding machines. Another diplomat spread theories that the start of the pandemic was due to a U.S. military labs experimentation. There seems to be a lack of control of Chinese diplomacy, which is worrying, precisely because it makes you wonder what else isn't under control. Are Chinese fighter pilots inclined to engage in some, dramatics? Are PLA Navy commanders all under control? The tone and the nature of the rhetoric is worrying and suggests how ill-prepared China is to handle a crisis of their own making.
Paul Evans, you want to come back on that?
Well, I think that framing Chinese actions as all assertive, all aggressive, is to misunderstand the complex tit-for-tat action-reaction system that has unfortunately emerged as the U.S. and China have plunged into a strategic competitive relationship. Many things that Xi Jinping's government are unfortunate and I think are going to be seen as counterproductive. But to simply put the spotlight on Chinese atrocities, Chinese problems, Chinese weaknesses is unfortunate. But more importantly, it doesn't catch the global picture. China is not losing in the world of global diplomacy. It's certainly losing in the context of the Western liberal democracies, but China's influence in its neighborhood and in the world more broadly is not being opposed. It is being, I would say, skeptically and cautiously adopted by much of the world. The balance of forces are shifting. And if it's us versus them, there's no clear outcome, no clear decision on which is going to triumph. Let's hope we can find a third path.
Joanna, as I get you back in here, I want to point out that you've got a book coming out about these issues in the fall. It's called China Unbound. And I want to pluck a little excerpt from it to read to you and our listeners and viewers right now, and then ask you a question coming out the other side. For too long, you write, Western societies have mishandled or simply ignored Beijing's actions out of narrow self-interest. Decades of willful misinterpretation have over time become complicity in the toxic diplomacy, human rights abuses, and foreign interference seen from China. Let's pick that apart a bit. What are we misinterpreting?
So actually, experts and people of Chinese descent living in Canada, for example, have been warning for years that China has been gearing up to be more aggressive and that they had been working in subtle ways to try to gain influence, foreign influence in Canada, such as resorting to trying to control the Chinese language media here through intimidation, coercion. Chinese officials have, I found out in my reporting, have visited the homes of Canadians trying to get them to stop talking about things like the Hong Kong pro-democracy protests. And I just argue in my book that disinformation has been out for decades. I've seen testimonies to Parliament back in 2006 by Canadians trying to warn Canada, like, it can't just be about economic and trade with China all the time. They need to be aware that there's other aspects of the relationship happening that they can't ignore, because at some point it's going to just blow up. And we've seen this get to a point where it's very difficult to get back to a place where you can have constructive conversations, because I think a lot of countries in the West have hoped that by engaging with China and focusing on economic trade and being fine with China becoming a huge economic power because it would benefit them as well, has gotten to a point where now we're having conversations about what to do with hostage-taking diplomacy, what to do with what's happening in Xinjiang. And these are huge problems that we could have had 10 years or more to think about and evaluate, rather than just kind of scrambling now. So I feel a lot of nations are playing catch up because they had been trying to be willfully ignoring some of these really messy aspects of authoritarian China. And I do talk in my book, and I do agree with Paul about how we have to look domestically as well, especially the U.S. trying to be a leader. Now they're trying to form more alliances with Canada, with the EU, Australia, to place these sanctions, for example, on China. It's not very convincing. Like, the Trump administration alone has given China so much propaganda material to call the West a hypocrite when you have rioters trying to disrupt and dismantle results of a democratic election. So,
forgive me,
also,
Joanna, I'm going to jump in for a second because, Paul Evans, I'm keeping an eye on the clock for you. I know we lose you in about 2 minutes because you've, like many people nowadays, have got Zoom feeds back to back to back. So maybe just give us a final comment, if you would, on the work that the Institute at your university is doing on the issue of the Uyghurs, and how, at face value, we ought to take the comments that the ambassador made in our interview about them living happy, healthy lives in China.
Well, I think one of the important issues going forward is what we're going to do in our universities in maintaining contact with China, but also looking at it through a realistic and critical eye. The Xinjiang Documentation Center at UBC brings together materials from many different perspectives. And it paints a picture in Xinjiang that is more complicated than what the ambassador had to say, but also rather different than what is coming out from some of the reports that have been quoted by our parliamentarians and others. The situation on the ground is complicated. And I think most importantly, Steve, is our universities have a role in trying to understand and explain why China is doing what it is doing in certain circumstances. Preventive terrorism of the kind they're trying in Xinjiang is disproportionate, probably counterproductive. But it does have we've got to get at why that terrorism threat is there. Is there anything we can do collectively around these things that in the longer term will actually improve the situation in Xinjiang, rather than just taking a critical and sanctions perspective?
Paul Evans from the University of British Columbia, we're grateful that you could spare as much time as you did for us, and now we release you to take your other Zoom call. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to be with you.
Not at all. David Mulroney, I'm going to rely on you now to pick up from where Paul Evans left off. He said that the situation with the Uyghurs in China is a lot more complex than either the human rights groups or the government of China is letting on. What's your view on it?
Well, my jaw dropped when he talked about preventive terrorism, and this worries me deeply. This isn't preventive terrorism. Xinjiang is an area of Western China that's as large as the southwest of the United States. It has it's just a little bit smaller in population than Ontario. And as you said at the outset, China is engaged in a massive operation to essentially remove the Uyghur people, to erase a culture, with more than 1 million incarcerated, with the kind of forced sterilization and forced abortion, where, despite what the ambassador said, in recent terms, population rates in major Uyghur centers, like Kashgar, are plummeting, where Uyghurs are being used for forced labor, not just in Xinjiang, but across China. And this is unprecedented. But it's not just what's happening at present, it's because China in Xinjiang is experimenting with the 21st century surveillance state. They're now looking at technology in China that measures in classrooms the emotional engagement of the student. So students are now deeply stressed that they're not looking concerned enough at the camera as they speak. What's happening should worry us. It's not tit for tat. It's a principled response to the single greatest humanitarian outrage in recent time. And the trying to explain it really only undermines our opportunity to understand what's happening and plays into a tendency to avoid what is unpleasant and seems very difficult to deal with. And at a time when we should be ramping up our sanctions and thinking more about what we can do to make this, to make clear that we understand what's happening and there will be consequences, that kind of argumentation is, I think, inaccurate and unhelpful.
Well, Joanna, we've got Ambassador Mulroney's view. We've got Professor Evans' view. They're both very different views. Where do you come at this?
I share Ambassador Mulroney's kind of disapproval of some of Mr. Evans' language, even though I feel bad because he's not here right now to defend his language. He may have misspoken. But I do think that it's helpful to have the context of what led to the Chinese government resorting to internment camps of 1 million Uyghurs, because that is very extreme. In 2009, there was a deadly riot in Urumqi in Xinjiang, where actually Han Chinese, so people who look like me, ethnic majority in China, who had been encouraged to migrate to the Xinjiang area in a government kind of campaign to try to, they say it's to like improve the economy there, but a lot of Uyghurs who have lived there for centuries, for millennia, say that it was a way to dilute them, to forcibly assimilate them. And these tensions led to fatal clashes on the streets between Han Chinese and Uyghur people. And it's unclear how many died, but it's clear that people on both sides, both ethnic groups, suffered and were the perpetrators. But what the Chinese state did was that they completely blamed the Uyghurs. They blamed Uyghur extremism and terrorism for this violence. And since then, they've stepped up incrementally the security presence in Xinjiang, the monitoring, the high-tech surveillance that Mr. Mulroney talked about. And I actually spoke with people who survived months in these internment camps, and they tell me they were taken for things like just being on a business trip. I spoke with a Kazakh woman in my book who was just there in Xinjiang buying some textiles for her shop in Kazakhstan, and for some reason she was suspected of some crime and taken to this camp for 15 months. And she was given like a Chinese name, a code, and she had no access to her family back home. And another man, he was persecuted for having a CD in his home that had costumes of Turkic nature, because China sees the Uyghur people's identification with the Turkic type of ethnic groups as also somehow criminal. So these things, I think it's dangerous to brand it as anywhere close to terrorism, because what the Chinese state is doing is that it's taking all of these people, and they don't know, you could do anything and it could be seen as you might become a terrorist. It's kind of like a potential, like you're interested in a Turkic costume, maybe you want Xinjiang to be separate and you're a terrorist. So I think it's important for us not to adopt the language of China that legitimizes their intense paranoia of so many people becoming terrorists, when there has been isolated violence, but years ago, and there's no evidence that there's a widespread terrorism movement right now in Xinjiang.
I want to thank both of you for joining us on TVO tonight. We thank Paul Evans from UBC earlier, Joanna Chu, who reports for the Toronto Star on Canada-Chinese issues. Look for her book this fall, China Unbound. And David Mulroney, we didn't get the pleasure of seeing your face this time, but we certainly heard your wisdom. Our former ambassador to China from 2009 to 2012. We're grateful you could spare some time for us tonight here on TVO as well. Many thanks, you too.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario. And by viewers like you. Thank you.